People sometimes ask US historians if the US is the new Rome. And the question refers, it depends on the questioner, either to America's dominance and magnificence, the great accomplishments and etc., or to American decline and soon fall. And without getting into that question, those who have studied, those who are interested in Roman history, those who like Roman history, I think all of us have wondered whether Romans understood what, whether they saw what we see, whether in the century or so, in the late first century BC and in the latter part of the first century BC and the first half of the first century AD, there you go. During that time when their republican system of self-government was transforming back into monarchy, whether they noticed it, whether they could tell that this was all a sham, okay, all this republicanism, all this rule of law stuff, because they lived in a country that had all the trappings of a representative republic, governed by law, governed by a legislature. They could point to the Senate, they could point to the plebeian assembly, they could point to a body of laws, they could point to the courts, to regular elections, all the protocols of representative of the Roman Republic, even after the Principate was established. Okay, still, the trappings were there of self-government. But we know that since the time of Caesar, definitely since Augustus, maybe even since Marius and Sulla, that this was a kind of monarchy. Okay, that this was a country, this was a people that were governed through arbitrary power, not governed by law. And so the question is, I'm sometimes asked this by question, if they believed in it. Did they know this? Did they know that this was all just theater, and that in fact they were living in a kind of monarchy? Did they realize that there were no longer people who were governing themselves and who were governed by the law? So I think that's the interesting question about Rome. And if you're going to ask, are we the new Rome and everything else, I think it's an interesting way to understand maybe what the Romans were seeing and not seeing if we look at ourselves and see, where do we stand on this? And, one can conduct a test to determine whether you live in a monarchy or a representative republic, or whether you are governed by the law that represents the will of the governed. So whether the people govern themselves through law, or are we governed by the arbitrary will of the ruler or rulers? And so I encourage you to take a pen and paper and just list the characteristics of a representative republic in which people, again, govern themselves by submitting to laws that they themselves pass. And on the other side of the page, the characteristics of a monarchy or a dictatorship in which the people are governed by the will of the ruler. And then after you list the parameters of this kind of country and the parameters of this kind of country, try to evaluate where your country stands. And again, go back to think of that question that my students ask about whether despite all the trappings of republicanism and self-government that the Romans had, whether they could see that this was all baloney, as we can see, or as we think that we can see. So again, think of, of course, any one of us can point to, we have a Congress, we have elections, we have this and this and that. But again, look at that page that you've constructed and think, okay, if all these trappings, excuse me, is that real or is that a facade? If Congress disappeared from the face of the earth tomorrow, would the United States operate very differently than it has in the past generation or so? Again, I think it's interesting for us individually, for us looking at the United States, and for us thinking about other republics today or throughout history, to conduct this test and to see for yourself where you think that your country is, whether you can see, well, in any case, whether this is a facade or a real functioning self-governing society. The interesting thing, though, is that regardless of where you wind up, if you conduct this test for yourself, this is self-examination for yourself, the American people have already answered this question collectively in a kind of a crowdsourcing exercise when Antonin Scalia passed away a few years ago. For those of you who remember, and I think most of you do, because it was such an earthquake, you remember that his death sent a thunderbolt through the citizenry, the media, and the halls of every local, state, and federal government in the land. It created the kind of uncertainty and anxiety that we associate with the death of a medieval king or a Soviet dictator. A situation in which the death of a single ruler, a single magistrate, a single government official can change everything in the country. It clarifies that this person really is important. His life or death changes the meaning of every law that we have on the book, or can invalidate or make real any law we have on the books. So everyone in the country at the time, everyone who barely even marginally followed the news, understood that that moment, the death of that Supreme Court justice, casts grave doubts about the standing and the meaning and the applicability of virtually every law and every regulation in the United States, local, state, and federal level. And this anxiety was well placed because with Scalia gone, the Supreme Court stood at 4 liberal Democrats and 4 conservative Republicans. And there was a Democratic president in the White House. In this recognition that everything can change now. Every law in America can change if a person fills, depending on who fills Scalia's seat. And it's motivated both political parties to redouble their efforts to name Scalia's replacement. Because, again, both sides recognize that if Scalia will be replaced by a Democratic president, the laws in this country will change without a single act of Congress. You don't need Congress to pass a law to change a bevy of policies and laws and regulations that govern our lives privately and publicly. So Democrats were giddy at this opportunity, whereas Republicans were scrambling. They were in dire straits, they thought. So, so both parties and all the citizens and all the explainers on TV and radio demonstrated that they understood that Americans are ruled not by the law or by legislatures that pass laws, but rather they're ruled by kind of royal authority wielded by the federal bureaucracy and especially by the federal court. And so Scalia's death revealed that, or it revealed what everyone already sensed long before, that what determines the meaning of the law is not the law itself. It's not what the law says. Rather, what determines the meaning of the law is the person who happens to occupy this or that powerful post in the executive, and even more so in the judiciary. So Americans, by their actions, maybe if you ask them, do you live in a republic? Do we self-govern, et cetera, most people would say yes, I think. But by their actions, by their anxiety, by their fear, by their commitment to have their party fill that seat, they indicated that they believed or understood, depending on your perspective, that Americans are governed not by the law, meaning they're not by the will of the governed, but by the will of the ruler, okay? by the will of the powerful government official or judge. And take for example, the drama, the unfolding drama of gay marriage in America. Okay? California gay marriage became, excuse me, gay marriage became the law of the land in California, despite the fact that the legislature of the California legislature passed a law forbidding it. Okay, so the people of California, through their elected representatives, passed a law forbidding gay marriage in California. But the California Supreme Court struck down that law, saying that it violated the state constitution. Okay, so the citizens of California, again, through the representatives and through their election process, change the state constitution to make it legal, okay? To make it legal to outlaw gay marriage, which they did with that constitutional amendment. Okay, so it was, since the judges California judges said, no, you cannot pass a law to regulate marriage this way because the state constitution forbids it, Californians changed the state constitution to allow it and then forbade it through the constitution. It was an effort to force the will of the governed, of Californians, on the judges. And so the court responded by striking down that constitutional amendment. And then numerous states passed laws and constitutional amendments on the state level prohibiting gay marriage, okay? In conformity with the way that the citizens understood marriage and understood their state constitutions, state law and state constitution, okay? Based on 250 years of American legal and constitutional jurisprudence. At which point, so once more states passed laws and constitutional amendments forbidding it, the Supreme Court, federal court, struck down all of these state laws and state constitutional amendments, enforcing gay marriage on all the states. Okay, so state legislatures had no say in it. The US Congress had no say in it. American citizens had no say in it. The court enforced it. And this is not a comment against or for gay marriage. It's, I don't care about that here. My point is about the process of governing. Okay? Who governs? Who determines how we're going to organize our lives? Okay? The fact that such a major policy could be enacted without any legislature enacting an actual law to authorize it, to authorize gay marriage, clearly goes against not only the idea of representation and government by consent, that people pass laws that they enforce on themselves, but it also goes against the structure, the constitutional order of the United States established by the US Constitution. Okay? Congress is not permitted to delegate its legislative authority to another body. Okay? And yet, the federal courts create new policies as a matter of course. They in effect legislate regularly, striking down existing laws and passing and enacting new policies that don't have to go through the legislatures, they simply go through the court. Okay, so either eliminating old laws or creating new laws. Okay. But so we understand that striking down existing laws might be considered, I mean, but by now is considered part of the Supreme Court's duty. That's part of the job description. But articulating new laws certainly is not part of the Supreme Court's mandate. That is reserved to the legislature. And the executive acts as a lawgiver even more often and more extensively than do the courts. Okay, so there's a great complaint from both sides, depending on the issue, about the court being committing a violation or stepping beyond its province and creating law. Okay. People on the left complain about it when they think the court is too conservative and vice versa. And there's a focus on the court being activist, the court legislating from the bench, rather than letting the legislatures do it. But that process of legislating without passing laws, legislating around the legislature, happens more often in the executive level than it does, and more thoroughly on the executive level than in the judiciary. First, and we all know this, presidents issue executive orders that have the force of law. Okay, for example, well, forget example, they're legion. Okay, the president also enacts international treaties on his own authority without congressional approval or ratification. And so there are treaties, international treaties that go through congressional or senatorial authorization, ratification to become U.S. law and U.S. policy henceforth. But the president can enter into agreements on behalf of the United States that remain in order, in effect, throughout his presidency. And the next president can either continue or not continue, but during the course of his presidency, that is essentially the law of the land. Okay. And third, and this is the most consequential element in this respect, Congress has delegated its legislative powers to rule-making executives and regulatory agencies that that over which the citizens have no power. Okay, they're not accountable to the citizens. Okay, in fact, they're not accountable to the citizens at all because these are civil servants. Okay, they're not elected to office, and they're not even, 90% of them are not confirmed by Congress even. Okay, so they have virtually no accountability to Congress either. And in fact, they even have limited accountability to the executive branch itself, meaning to the president, their boss. Okay, so these executive agencies who make all these rules, etc., that govern everything we do in our daily lives, are governed only loosely by congressional law. They operate in accordance to a huge body of law known as administrative law. Okay? And these laws were written by these executive agencies themselves. And when citizens have a dispute with such an agency, let's say you have the Fish and Wildlife Agency, whatever it's called, or the ATF, or the some other bureaucracy we have, issue some sort of fine, and you complain about it, you try to challenge that ruling, the disputes are not adjudicated in a normal court of law. Okay? They're not adjudicated in the judiciary branch, but rather in an administrative court run by the agency itself. So laws that we citizens enacted through our legislatures to protect suspects from police and prosecutorial overreach and misconducts do not apply in administrative courts. Rulings are handed down not by a jury, but by an administrative judge picked and paid by the agency. And guilt is determined not by the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, like in our courts, but by a standard of preponderance of evidence, which is the lower bar. Okay, so if you're the defendant, you're more vulnerable to a negative judgment than in a regular court of law. So and these regulatory agencies operate also as police, judge, and jury in enforcing laws that they themselves wrote. So these are not legislatures. We didn't vote for these people, and yet they pass laws, they enforce them, they adjudicate them, and then they act as jury in those cases that they themselves adjudicate. And not only is the citizens' consent absent from the operations of these executive and regulatory agencies, this consent is also absent in funding them. Okay, we don't even determine, we don't even hold the power of the purse over these agencies and their executive law courts, et cetera, et cetera. So first, instead of being funded by Congress, as the Constitution requires, these agencies generate some of their own funding through fees that they charge companies and individuals who come before them, who work with them. So these fees don't go to the treasuries, to the United States Treasury, that then hands funds to the different executive offices, but rather the fees go directly to the agency itself. So it basically governs itself, passes laws for itself, and funds itself, completely separate from the constitutional structure outlined by the Constitution. So if Congress tomorrow decides, okay, we're not funding the EPA anymore, or immigration services, or Fish and Wildlife, or whatever, these agencies will still have money to do some of their work because they can fund themselves with fees and fines that they hand out without congressional appropriations. And actually, the fines are also are very important because the penalties, the penalty that you pay to that agency or to that regulatory agency, the FEC or whatever else, again, don't go to the Treasury, they go directly to the agency itself, or dispersed directly to projects that the agency wants to fund. And the last element of this kind of independent government, a government that is not accountable to the citizenry and does not reflect the consent of the governed, is that even though Congress is required by law to pass a budget every year, it occasionally chooses not to. Okay, and at times, I won't mention the times, but the federal government went for 2 or 3 years without a budget, without an approved budget. Okay? Yet the bureaucracy, of course, needs money to operate, and so it spends money, and the Treasury Department collects money, as do other executive agencies, completely extra legally. Okay? There's supposed to be a budget, and yet there isn't, and yet the money gets collected and dispersed, et cetera, et cetera. So, so again, back to the question of whether the Romans understood what we understand now about their kind of system. Without the death of Scalia, I would have said, look, I don't know, it's kind of complicated, and who knows, maybe 2,000 years from now, historians would be looking at Americans and seeing all these things under the surface, showing that you have this, popular government, these trappings and institutions of self-government on the surface, but below them is the real government that is unaccountable to the citizens. Okay, it operates independently of them, and those people in the past would ask, did Americans understand? Did they think that this was all a sham and that in fact they're not governed by the law, but by these powerful bureaucrats or judges, etc.? And the interesting thing is, again, that that moment, it was this revelatory glimpse into the psyche of Americans of all walks of life, left and right, indicating that they understood that Americans do think, perhaps like the Romans did, that this is, again, maybe we were wrong. Okay, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, but it's certainly an indication that Americans do not believe that they're ruled by the law. That they don't believe that the will of the citizens is what shapes public policy. They thought that the person who occupies an important seat in the government, that person's will is what shapes public policy.